moderating this panel is Duane Barnes. Duane's the Senior Vice President of Technology at RapidScale, a Cox business company that provides cloud solutions to companies and organizations around the world. So, Duane?
All right, welcome everyone. Hopefully you got enough caffeine. I know the after lunch sessions are always the sleepy ones, right? So we're going to talk about corporate data security on this panel, and I'm going to let the gentlemen on stage introduce themselves, although I believe every one of them's already been on a panel today, so we'll keep the intros brief. But Nick, why don't you get us started?
Hey, I'm Nick with CommTech, Nick Michler. I'm the engineering lead out there. So as part of my duties, I oversee our clients' journey through getting secure and having a good working system.
I'm Joe Grettenberger. I work for NetDocuments. I am the compliance manager at NetDocuments and deal with lots of different audits, do internal audits myself. I oversee those as well as our third-party auditors. So that's what I do.
Most of you were here when I had my talk earlier, so I won't drag you through all that again in the intro, but I'm responsible for security, compliance, and fraud for a $2 billion phone company in 157 countries. Yahoo!
Awesome. Thanks, guys. So let's keep this interactive, similar to the earlier sessions. We've got a list of canned questions we're going to ask the moderators, but definitely raise your hand. Bridget's got a mic. She'll run around to the various tables so we can get you picked up on the audio because we are recording these. So keep it interactive, ask questions as we go. Let's not wait till the end to hold your questions. We'll do our best to get them all answered. So we've got a group of people up here that should all be able to answer most of these questions. So we'll kind of pose the question, let them chime in as they feel like they've got some content to add. So the first one is, what should I do to protect my assets now that the IRS, Social Security, credit bureaus were hacked, exposing all that's needed by hackers to impersonate you or your company?
Why don't you go first? You want to take it? I'll take it. Well, so the software that's being used today does have some additional controls in it that it didn't. TurboTax, for example, requires you now to enter your driver's license and taking more steps to make sure that you are who you say you are before you can even file your tax. So if you're doing it electronically, those controls are being added here in the last few years. Does that mean that that's a surefire way that you're going to be protected? Not necessarily. I mean, if you're a good hacker, you can get driver's license information as well. So there are other steps, I'm sure. You guys want to chime in?
Yeah, so I think part of the mindset there is that we used to believe that if we're giving data to a company that it's protected because they're a company, right? And they're going to do their best. But I think now, after all these breaches in a post-2016 world, we realize that maybe we shouldn't be trusting all these companies with our data, and that we should be asking them for the certifications and compliance standards that Mike pointed out in his presentation earlier. If we're doing our job and if we're asking them to see their certifications and make sure that we're signing things like BAAs to confirm that they're actually going to keep up with their standards, I think it's a good place to start. Mike?
Actually, the longer I live, and certainly in recent years, I realize there is no company that hasn't been breached. Each one of your companies has been penetrated. You just probably don't know it. And therefore, it's important to make sure that no matter what certifications they have, although that's one of the better things, that you're not sharing anything more than you need to. Go with the same thing that our government does or tries to do, use that least access method, as the JP Morgan Chase people mentioned, for instance, because just about any information you expose out there probably could find its way into the wrong hands. And remember that just about everything that people need to be able to take your identity or your business financial assets is out there. As someone was saying after one of the meetings here, if you're interesting enough and the negative resources out there really want to hack into you, they will. So be prepared for that and be very much aware of what you need to do once you realize you've been breached. And I'm, for one thing, a pretty big fan of drills. So what we do at 8x8 is I'll walk in early one morning and I'll tell the guys, okay, you've just been breached, what are you going to do? You know, who do you call at the FBI? Who do we call in local law enforcement? And by the way, that's a whole nother subject I'd like to talk about. FBI is only interested in things that is usually over 5 million or quite a bit. There are local resources that you can use instead. We can talk about that, but you should have that down to where it's basically almost a autonomic response for your teams to be able to follow the drill, because when it really comes down, they'll need that.
Yeah, a couple things to add to these guys' comments here. I think on a personal level, it's important to just pay attention to your own accounts, right? Get your free credit report, get your free, almost every bank, including Chase that was here, offer that service as free. So if you're paying attention to your own accounts, I think that's always helpful. Don't trust that the company you work for or do business with is protecting your data, as these guys have noted, right? So on to the next question here. What about all the new state and international privacy laws? What should the audience and business owners here be concerned with from a data privacy perspective? Go ahead.
Well, for many of us, it's new coding. So if I was a European citizen and I said, okay, I want to know everything you have, remember the 19 things I showed you earlier today? Of any of those 2 or 3 of the 19 things, I want to see everything you have about me, and think about all the AI and ML or machine language and artificial intelligence things you're doing, all the third parties that you're working with and so forth. How are you going to get that information? For most of us, it means recoding. It means coding what country the data came from, who it came from, having enough intelligence in the code that you can do quick database sorts, if it's even in a database, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of coding.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing people may not realize is not only do you have to be able to protect this data and secure it, but you have to be able to produce it when asked for. And it's data that you may not think of. You might have, we're in a casino right now. If this casino, technically speaking, records somebody on a camera that is from Europe, and they call next week and say, hey, I need all that footage, how is the casino going to find them in that footage? They were here for 30 minutes over a 108-hour span of video, right? So these are things that we should be thinking about in our processes, and not just about filling out forms, although that is the first step, but how are we going to change what we're doing?
I would like to add that with GDPR, there's a requirement for not just a risk assessment, but a particular kind of risk assessment called a data protection impact analysis or impact assessment. So as we've done in the past with security controls, we now need to do with privacy controls. So make sure that your risk assessment includes a data protection impact assessment that includes privacy type of controls as well.
That was well said. And then there's also various agreements if you have any divisions overseas that you're moving data back and forth with, right? Those have to be in place. It was mentioned earlier that your privacy shield should be, done and properly attested to, and be paying particular attention to whether you have an HR aspect of that. That's very important to the federal government. And then we haven't talked about data destruction, right? So it's not just hitting the delete key or saying, hey, this is marked for deletion. It's actual destruction. So that's another coding area.
Great. So I imagine most folks in the audience have a phone system, right, at their business, right? And probably many of the businesses here accept credit cards for whatever types of services they provide. What should business owners and IT folks be concerned about with a hosted voice system from a PCI perspective, or even just general PII when it comes to that phone system?
feel like I'm monopolizing.
Well, we did touch on this a little bit in the other panel, but the way VoIP systems are working today, especially if they're cloud-based, the best ones are going to have a lot of tools built in. I think earlier the gentleman up here from 8x8 talked about how they have technology that's turning off the recording on the line if it senses that they're going to start talking about credit card numbers and things like that. People when PCI tells you if you're transmitting, holding, storing any sort of credit card data, it's got to be on this kind of encryption. It's got to be here and there. People are normally thinking about typing it into a system. It's stored in a computer. They're not thinking about the phone call and the fact that it's going over the Ethernet, going over the internet, going over the network, and getting stored somewhere.
And there's so much more, right? So it's not just, so if you're not going with the scenario I described earlier, where all the code in that area that we often refer to as an iframe on the web page that your agent is typing in the credit card information to is maintained and owned strictly by the credit card service provider. And then you need to, does anybody know what a DMZ is, right? So you have to have a separate network segment. It has to be heavily regulated. So anybody that goes into that segment needs to be recorded, and that information needs to be stored for 7 years at least. Anyone who makes a change in any of the code there, that has to be recorded, and the change has to be documented, and the release of the change after having done a risk assessment has to be documented. And you even have to go further to do a hash level storage of what the code was before and after the change, and save that for 7 years. In addition to all that, you have to do strong encryption. So that means you have to bring your data in motion. We're going to talk more about encryption, I believe. Data in motion and data at rest encryption up to the PCI standards, which not all of us have it. Not everyone has that to start with. And that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and require a dedicated person. Other than that,
So there's a lot to think about there from a PCI perspective. So maybe let's shift a little bit to some tactical questions. We heard a lot earlier today about two-factor authentication. I think most of you have used it at some level, even if it's with your Gmail account or your Facebook account or your local bank account. But perhaps you might be interested in how easy or difficult is it to set up, and should you be thinking about that? So let's pose that one to the panel. How do you actually configure two-factor authentication?
So everyone here is familiar with two-factor, right? I mean, I think we all have to have some account that's texting us based on it every time we try to log in, right? So two-factor or multi-factor is basically saying, I need something normally a password. I need something you have, normally a cell phone. And if it's multi-factor, it's I need something you are. We're talking about biometrics there, a thumbprint, eye scan, face scan, something like that. Setting these up is a lot easier than it used to be. A lot of products that come today, as Mike pointed out, a lot of them actually have to offer it to you, so it's already set up. A lot of times it's as simple as going into the settings in your bank account and clicking turn on multi-factor authentication. And if you're talking about set it up for a corporation, though, or for your business, there are some great products out there for two-factor that are pretty much plug and play. And they aren't all made the same. There are some some better ones and worse ones. But basically, you can install these on your system. Normally, if you have an on-prem system, a small piece of software goes on a server just to verify where your location is and get all your users out of your server so that it knows who's trying to log in where. And from there, you can tie it into multiple things over APIs. I know, for instance, a lot of them will tie in with NetDocuments. A lot of them will tie in with your phone system, Google Docs, your email. We're talking about setup of maybe 4 to 8 hours to get all of these applications two-factored for your organization.
Yeah, so there are two-factor authentication happening. That implementation happens at multiple levels. It happens on the desktop or the laptop. It happens with your service provider, so your credit union, your bank, your document management system. It happens in an organization, so centered on Active Directory. As my colleague was pointing out here, this two-factor authentication is happening in multiple layers of your stack and with multiple service providers, and you do want to avail yourself as much as you can of this because it really does protect you. And you should also spin it up for all your service providers that are storing critical data.
The other thing you're going to run into is that many of you who are providing services to your customers, those customers will be requesting things like OAuth and SAML. Those are industry standards for single sign-on. Most single sign-on applications, Okta, One Login, things like that, have to be SAML or OAuth, SAML 2 or OAuth compatible or compliant. And this provides an extra level of security, in motion, for instance. And then you're also doing your users, and perhaps even yourself, a little favor, because the SSO scenario is that you have one login for all of your major applications, right? Your CRM, finance, and so forth. And you just log in once every few days or week or whatever your IT department and security people have set it as. And then after that, it will automatically log you in unless you've changed locations or whatever, all right? So, and that comes with the ability to support multiple types of 2FA or MFA. That could be from a company called RSA or any number of other Symantec. There's, as our colleagues here mentioned, there are many out there now.
And with single sign-on, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of us probably already have a means. We're halfway there with single sign-on. If you've got 365 email and you're syncing everything to the cloud, you're only a few steps away from having an Azure single sign-on tied to some multi-factor authentication product. At that point, everybody only has to know their Microsoft 365 login. From there, once they're in, they can click on any app in there and get direct access.
Yeah.
Add in dual-factor authentication, and it's a very secure system.
Great point. I'll just give a live example. There's probably a number of companies in here that use Salesforce for their CRM or other use cases. It's a couple check boxes to enable it and sync it up with Active Directory, right? So in our company, you can't go to salesforce.com and log in from the main Salesforce website. You have to go to an internal site that's protected with two-factor auth, and it links up to our Azure Active Directory, and then we get in that way. The beauty of it from an IT perspective is when someone's hired or fired, I go to one place to delete an account or create an account. I don't have to go to Salesforce's website and NetSuite's website and all the other application vendors that we use. So let's talk about employee culture around security. How important is it for the kind of the top-down effect from a security perspective as it relates to culture when it comes to things like turning on two-factor authentication or awareness training?
As a company that provides two-factor and sells it and sets it up for people, it's always good to start at the top to get them to buy in because ultimately they're the ones paying for it. But the user adoption is a big deal because if users aren't adopting this, it'll just be complaining and trying to work around it, and constant phone calls that I just left my phone at home. You need to just let me in the rest of the day and things like that. I think when we're going to implement these things, we're really excited to get them in, get them turned on, and start using them. And sometimes we kind of skip that user adoption phase where we're talking to people openly about how it works and why it's a good idea and trying to get them excited about it.
Yeah, executive buy-in I was going to mention that. If you don't have executive buy-in from the top, it's the Wild West in your organization when it comes to security, because what that means is that I can bring my own devices into the organization if I am trying to get some work done, and I can do it myself with my own devices. And you don't want that happening in your organization because that can cause all kinds of security problems. So culture is really driven, it's driven in a number of ways, but primarily from the top. Mike, wouldn't you say so?
Absolutely. In fact, kind of coming at it from a security guy perspective, as it were, most security professionals before going, certainly in the valley where they're in so much demand, probably anywhere, they're going to interview the C team and get a feel for whether the C team is going to enforce the various basic security governance. We use that word. Governance means that the company from the top down will not tolerate people not complying with the various security basics. And if you do not have that from the top down, you will not succeed. It's pretty much a one-to-one relationship. Now, there is something called the culture of security. So in addition to the top-down people caring about that and wanting to enforce it, it's up to the security group to form various social engineering things, such as setting up a security council with, someone from the C team, maybe even someone from the board, ideally. And for instance, in 8x8, we have the GC, we have someone from the board, we have the person that's basically our CIO. And when something isn't working, for instance, you can put out all the training, all the tools, and so forth, but if people aren't using them, somebody from the top has to come down and say that must be done. Now, how do you know they're using them? You have to have some kind of GRC monitoring tool. There are major dashboards. I probably shouldn't mention any of the big company names, but we're probably all thinking about a couple here that are famous for their ability to reduce corporate risk, and I'm sure you would be familiar with that, for instance, as a compliance person. And one of the ways that you can enforce that culture is to have dashboards in various departments that show Joe's group is doing less good than Ethel's group. And this puts a heavy amount of peer pressure. I'm going to really make a little confession here that when I first got to Visa, there were a couple of departments that weren't really following governance. And we embarrassed those departments into it by showing that, again, Harry's department wasn't doing as well as Joe's department, and that was being seen by the top executives. So I'll stop talking. I'm monitoring.
One more point, if I could, on that real quick. If you're not familiar with it, for those that are in compliance or work with compliance, there's something called the 7 elements of an effective compliance program that gets to some of these points, including governance and the need to have resources behind it. So, like Mike was saying, you not only need management to buy in, but you need that sponsor, that champion in your organization that'll drive it, and you need the resources to do that. And that's all part of the 7 elements of an effective compliance program.
Great. So I think probably some of the folks in the audience are overwhelmed by just all the information they've gotten today, right? Where do they even start? So if you're a business owner in the room or an IT person in charge of IT for a company in the room, and compliance is a concern, do you have to go create all this training on your own and deliver it and track it, or are there tools or companies or pieces of software out there that can help these individuals?
So no, you're not all by yourself. You don't have to go on a 3-month Google binge to try to figure out everything you need to know. I think we talked about the NIST framework earlier, and that is a great tool. It's an international organization, and they're just out there putting out information for companies, business owners like you, to kind of fast track you. Now, it's not small. I think there's some 200 forms in some portions of it, but by completing it, you're gonna at least find out how far away you are from being compliant and what steps you need to take. And there are people here to help you. CommTech helps perform audits of this nature. We're familiar with the NIST framework. We'll help walk you through it.
Yeah, I'm noticing a few people in the audience. It's called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, and it's readily available. Just Google Cybersecurity Framework, NIST. As far as the 7 elements of the effective compliance program, that comes out of the U.S. federal sentencing guidelines for organizations, and that actually those 7 elements are used to determine whether, in a penalty situation, where you're assessing fees to an organization, whether the judgment should be severe or whether it should go light. And if you've got these 7 elements in place in your organization, your penalty is likely to be a lot less than it would otherwise be had you not have these 7 elements in place. That's why they're in the federal sentencing guidelines.
Okay, so we start out by talking about training. So there are a number of training companies out there. There's Thomson Reuters and so forth that just have dozens and dozens of pre-built training programs. Most of you are probably familiar with a format called LMS or SCORM. Those are traditional training systems, and they'll track by employee whether they've completed all the tests of each training module, right? Now, when we're talking about governance, the problem you're going to run into is that if you just send out these training programs, not everyone is going to take them, right? You have to have contests, as was mentioned earlier. What we do at 8x8 is we stand people up in front of the whole company, basically, in our all-hands meeting, and compliment them on being the first to complete it, things like that. You reward people for things they're doing. They're not going to do it without that kind of trickery, I almost want to say. Then the other thing you need to do is you need to have not just training modules. You know, you can only get away with that per training module maybe once a year, right? Because there are several. You know, there's things to do with exploitation. There's, you know, anti-bribery. There's all kinds of things that have to go on. So people are already kind of used up in terms of that. So what you need to do for security is many of these companies will provide you little video snippets. They're actually very entertaining. And you send those out with like a juicy newsletter every couple of weeks or once a month. And you find that you can actually get people to do that. The other thing you do, and what I've seen work in many companies, is once a year you have an all-hands meeting and you have little booths there from compliance, from endpoint security, from endpoint IT, et cetera, and they have tchotchkes they get from the vendors, and you make kind of a party out of it, right? So there are lots of little tricky things that you can do to get people to start being aware of it. One of the most effective that I've seen is, in what I tried to do in the initial speech, is bring it home to you personally. You know, what's going to happen if you get home tonight and your money's gone? You know, that kind of thing. Start thinking about it as a person and how important, things like phishing and all those things are to you as a person. How many times have we gotten home and our wife has said, geez, I got this letter from Microsoft or Apple or something, and it turns out to be a phishing fraud letter.
You know, I talked to this Nigerian prince today. They hear we're going to have $1 million soon.
Yeah, in fact, I talked to one of our customers here, one of your customers from CommTech, and they had something that was fairly profound happening in that area.
Yeah, so just to recap, you're looking to introduce compliance into your business. You know, Mike mentioned a few of the company names, but you can literally start to finish, have it completely deployed to your company in a business day. You can sign up online, give them your credit card, whatever you got to do. They'll take your logos, they'll put it in all the video decks for you, and you can go hand select by checkboxes which courses you want to send out to your employees. So I think don't think it's overwhelming. It's not that complicated, and it'll email you a report daily or weekly of who's done it, who hasn't done it, how long they took to do it, and then you can create your reward systems that way.
And you can also normally customize your shame systems too. I like the Game of Thrones none with the bell personally, but
Yeah. So, great. So, go ahead, Mike.
Before we go into another one, we talked about things that can get you in trouble, if you don't follow the 7 principles, for instance. There's something that many of you may not, even our panelists, may not know about yet. But the federal government now, Cyber Command and others, if you haven't put an email address out there that says security @ and then your company name, you can be fined if you're breached for lack of due diligence. Why is this? By putting your company name, XYZ Corporation, we do it for 8x8. Let's just use our example, 8x8 @ security. That means if there's hackers out there, and believe me, there are, that are going to hack every company they can get to, and they find something, a lot of them will just give you a freebie. They're just going to tell you, hey, I was able to hack into this or that, and you should take care of that. That's why they have it as a rule now.
Great point. So there might be some folks in the room that maybe they don't have a security person on staff, and they're thinking about hiring one. Obviously, if they're hiring one, they're probably not the expert in security, so it's a chicken and egg conversation. But from an interview process, what one or two things should they really focus on to make sure that they're hiring the right candidate for their business?
Wow, that's a good one. Well, you guys are thinking, I'll talk. How about that? Okay, so in the Silicon Valley, security people are worth their weight in diamonds, right? It's just embarrassing what we have to pay them to get them in money and RSUs. And so what I look for, at least, for what that may or may not be worth, is somebody who's willing to work in the Valley. If you don't work 9 or 10 hours a day and catch up on weekends, you're probably not going to make it with us, right? That's number one. Number two, they've had to be a security person for 8 to 10 years already and have their various compliances, CISSP, CISM, probably ethical hacker, et cetera, in order for the interview cycle to go successfully, for instance, in 8x8, because it's not just me that's interviewing them, it's our various technical people as well. And I think that's pretty close there. We're big on diversity. Women are kind of favored. Usually you're a little bit more, they make good hackers, among other things. And I'll turn it over to you guys.
No, that's what I was going to mention. You want to make sure that you're looking for someone who is certified CISSP, as Mike mentioned. But that does not necessarily mean that they are the right person. It just means you've got a bare minimum there to get into. You also, like Mike said, you want to look for years' experience. Have they been around the area that your business is in? Do they have experience in healthcare, for example, if that's what your business is, or do they have experience in banking, if that's what your business is? So that kind of experience is very valuable, because what that means is, it's true that controls are similar from organization to organization, but when a security person has had the training to think in terms of a particular kind of framework, that helps. That helps a lot. So
Actually, let me just add something that I'm pretty passionate about. He's absolutely right. I will not hire somebody who hasn't had hands-on direct responsibility for NIST, as an example.
Yeah.
Great. So let's shift to Wi-Fi for a second. I think many of you, if not all of you, probably have Wi-Fi in your homes and at office. One of the general topics that we've been discussing up here and elsewhere today is around, passwords for Wi-Fi. And I think, I visit a whole lot of people's offices in a week, a month, a year, and almost never, from the first time I went there, did they change their Wi-Fi password to the next time I showed up. So how important is that, guys? What are you guys seeing out in your day-to-days?
So changing passwords in general is really important. Wi-Fi passcodes, especially one for a guest network, needs to be changed regularly. You may be segmented, but somebody can get in and perform all sorts of things on your network. They might be trying to take all your bandwidth to make things super painful for everybody else, even if it is a segmented guest network. People tend to not be shy about handing over Wi-Fi passwords, especially millennials like myself. We've grown up with Wi-Fi. First thing you do when you walk in somebody's house, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password, right? And I think people don't think about that. Someone says, hey, I can't get this guest network to work. Oh, just use ours. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, dumb password, And so, yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, I would say that's part of cyber hygiene, to not give it out liberally, and to, of course, segment your guest network from your corporate network. And then if you can, make it a fairly strong password, because if you've got a visitor who knows your Wi-Fi password on your guest network, they can come by sometime later and hop on your guest network and start playing around. And So you do need some kind of rigor, I think, around Wi-Fi passwords.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, and if I can add, newer technology today is making this easier for us. There's even, self-generating Wi-Fi passwords. Someone comes in and needs it. A lot of the business level Wi-Fi solutions you're putting in today, it's almost like taking a ticket at the butcher, right? Hey, I need Wi-Fi password. Okay, somebody receptionist pushes a button on our computer and it spits out a password just for that person that lasts the 2 hours they're going to be there.
Yeah, that's exactly what it. Go ahead.
The other importance of segmenting, how many people know that if somebody's on a particular Wi-Fi segment and doing something that's high bandwidth, it's going to slow everyone else down, right? So it's important to segment pretty highly to start with, both from prod and guest. And then how many people are making sure that anything done with development is what we call air-walled, so completely separate from production. So there's no way that one can connect with the other. In my career, I find so many companies that violate that principle.
Yeah, I find that when we send our engineers to assist a customer complaining about Wi-Fi performance, the fix is always changing the password. It kicks off whoever's causing the problem 9 times out of 10. So really basic tenet there. But I was going to say what Nick said. Sometimes it's the office manager or receptionist, whoever greets the person asking for that password, it's a great task for them to do. Just press a button, one-time password, it works for the day. It's no different than the hotels or airplane Wi-Fi or, airport lounges where, they're constantly changing the password. So it's a good habit to be in. Joe, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, well, Mike started talking about air wall or air gap is what we call it. Make sure that your corporate network is firmly air gapped, I think, from your guest network. And then anything that's administrative privileges, you've got to have multi-factor authentication, even within your own corporate network. You really shouldn't be having your admin area accessible by the rank and file employee.
Yeah, or the FedEx guy that walks in every day at the same time.
Right.
Right. Heard that story a few times. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We got about 10 minutes left, so hopefully we'll get some questions here. So feel free to raise your hand if anything you want clarification on. So let's say I'm a company out here in the audience, and I know that I've been breached. What's the first thing I should do?
Determine with huge emphasis and bold type with exclamation points, determine the nature of the breach. Most security people get false alarms several times a week. Oh, I've been breached, and it turns out to be a phishing letter or something that's not really a breach, right? So the first thing, and in fact, at 8x8 we go a step further. We drill people in evaluating what level they feel that the breach or the incident has achieved, and of course then you have to determine whether there's PII or EPHI, personal information or electronic health information, or GDPR, whatever information involved. And then the other thing is you should absolutely have a relationship with your local law enforcement. This may be FBI, it may be in the Silicon Valley, it's actually the Sheriff's Department that has a cyber investigation team. You should make sure that your GC has one of his attorneys are more cognizant of what needs to be done for various types of breaches. And with that, I will not monopolize the talk further.
Both excellent points, especially the determining if this is actually a hack. I think in our ticketing system, at least once a day, we'll get a ticket in giant bold letters that is, I have been hacked, and then their password needs to be reset or something. But also, law enforcement's a really, really good point. I know some of our customers that have had breaches before, they'll reach out to us, reach out to their cyber insurance company, things like that. Normally one of the first things we ask is let's get involved with law enforcement. I know that the FBI has a presence here just down the street at Shell Square, I believe, and they actually have an agent that works with local businesses to help figure out how much investigation is needed.
Actually, do you mind if I
go ahead.
speak to that real quick, then I'll give it to you.
Go ahead.
So that's really an important point. So anybody ever hear of something called InfraGuard? Good. So if you join, I'm very pleased to see that, you guys. So if you join InfoGuard, you get to go to meetings with your local FBI people, and you get to know them, and you get to develop a relationship with them. And when the chips are down, let me just tell you that after working with some people in InfoGuard for years, when we had what we suspected to be an incident, so far we've never been breached to that level at 8x8, but I was able to call these guys on the weekend, and they helped me on the weekend. Actually, it was an attack from one of our jealous competitors that that they helped us with. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all good. Good advice. And I mean, I didn't even think about a weekend. I mean, what's the value of being able to call somebody on a weekend? That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, not only that, it's two FBI people. One's married to the other, and he and his wife. They both jumped on to help me. They got people in Washington, D.C., cell phone. I mean, it was incredible. And we tracked down where this attack came from. And, yeah, more than that I probably shouldn't say.
So those connections are worth their weight in gold, I think. I mean, that's a really good sales pitch for why joining InfoGuard is a good idea. What I was going to mention is under healthcare, there's a 4-step risk assessment that you do when you think that you've been breached. There's a famous model called LOW-PRO-CO, which is short for low probability of compromise. So if you type in LOW-PRO-CO and look at those 4 steps, those apply to any vertical, any organization, any industry. It used to be a risk of harm standard that we were looking at in healthcare, but now it's the probability of compromise is what they talk about there. So those 4 steps are critical. If you think you've been breached, you want to make sure that you know what was breached, the type of data that was breached, as Mike mentioned, and then go from there.
And then you should have a call tree. Anybody know what a call tree is? Okay, so yeah, so you should have a call tree as to how it can be escalated, and you should tie the degree of breach to the type of escalations. And you don't want to call the CIO in the middle of the night if it's...
No, those are all great ones, and just summary, and I'll emphasize a couple of the points. Definitely call your local police department or sheriff's office, depending on where you're located, and just ask who the person is. Set up an appointment a month from now. Go have coffee with them. Get to know them, because they're absolutely right. So they're going to be way more willing to even just respond to you if they've met you in person before.
And I'm willing to bet that CommTech can professionally help you with it.
Exactly.
And your cybersecurity insurance person is someone you're also going to want to have in speed dial, because that's also one of the first phone calls you're going to want to make.
Yeah, and then the decision tree, right? You don't want your lowest level employee calling anybody of authority at that point, especially not the law enforcement. They don't like the false alarms too much, but definitely have a couple levels of escalation, and then there needs to be a person or two that has the ability to pick up the phone at that point and call law enforcement.
And all of this is should be in an incident response plan. So create an incident response plan for your organization, because all of this information would be in that plan, hopefully.
It's just like the fire escape route. There should be a one-pager posted probably right next to all your fire escape routes, what to do, and run out the door and run away from it's not the answer, of course.
How many people actually in the audience, just let me poll you, and don't be embarrassed, please, have what they consider to be a agreed upon, hardened incident management plan?
Great, we got about...
There are a few of you, good.
Yeah.
You find a lot of companies don't
Shaky.
really have that as well as they should.
Great. Well, we have 3 or 4 minutes left. Is there any questions in the audience? Right here up front, Ryan.
Yep. So you guys talked about, not just you, but several panels, the multi-factor authentication. I recently read an article where a phone was compromised and money was taken out of the account, basically using that multi-factor authentication. Seems like the threats are always changing, but any suggestions on maybe how to prevent that or best practice?
So multi-factor is a great tool, but I think, as Mike has pointed out several times, if a baddie really wants to get you, there's only so many walls you can put in front of it before they eventually break through. SAML, OAuth, the kind of things Mike was talking about. Yes, it is possible. You can do something like a man-in-the-middle attack, which we're going to talk about a little later. and somebody can essentially capture what you're sending, figure out what algorithms are making these codes, and get into your accounts and things like that.
And it's really important. So, from my point of view, I would ask a number of questions to you to determine more details about what happened. For instance, we see a lot of companies that aren't natting, for instance, their phone, if it's VoIP you're talking about, and just a whole number of other basics, right? And then you see this article about, oh my God, this has happened, and the company hasn't even, done some of the basics. So, I'd be willing to find out about that. And then you probably know that RSA is one of the third-party or 2FA companies. There was some breaches with them a while back, but to my knowledge, at least, very little actually happened in terms of exploits of that breach.
Yeah.
So it was pretty hard to do.
The beauty of 2FA is most of the tokens are only good for seconds, right? So it's going to be tough to replicate that. Another question in the middle here.
Yeah, I didn't understand that thing you said earlier about security, having an email address with security in it. Can you explain that?
I'm sorry, say the question
The
again.
email address that you said a company has to have one with security in it, like 8x8 at security. I didn't understand what you said about that.
Yeah, so basically the general idea is you should have an email address security at your domain name, so that you can be contacted by authorities or others.
Oh, I see what you're
Gray
saying.
hats.
I wasn't clear on what you were asking. Yeah, so there is you can publish an email address. You can have it on your website or whatever. Just putting it out there because hackers are using it now, whether you have it or not. And again, if you're breached and you don't have it, Cyber Command could find you. So it is security, the word security with the @ sign, and then your company name .com or .org or whatever you are.
Yep.
The same goes for the term privacy now. So you really also ought to have privacy at,
Yes.
and then your organization's name as well, because with not only GDPR, but CCPA and the New York, and all these laws are going to just keep coming. And so privacy at your organization's name is becoming very important as well.
And I imagine we're out of time, but really quick, you should be Privacy Shield if you're even at risk of dealing with European clients. And Privacy Shield requires a resolution group, and your resolution group will help you with your privacy website. For instance, if you're using TrustArc, used to be called Trustee, and various other groups, they'll help you with your privacy website, and you are required to have that. If you don't have a privacy statement on your website, you could be fined.
A privacy policy.